Welcome, Center for Sustainability Solutions and our Sustainability Talk series. My name is David Hart. I'm the director here. It's great to have you with us. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Sarah Sturtevant, who's come up from Southern Maine to be with us. She began working on affordable housing via a circuitous pathway. She grew up on a chicken farm in Maine and put herself through college at Bowdoin. When she graduated, I heard her say that there weren't a lot of jobs in Maine, so she began a decades-long career in investment management, both in New York City and in Boston. We're glad that it took her a while, but she got back here in 2020. And she enrolled at the Muskie School of Public Policy, where we have a lot of partnerships, have had for almost 20 years, the Muskie School. And she was in the Public Policy Analysis graduate program, where she graduated in 2023. She, as you'll find out, she's done a lot of innovative research on affordable housing, both as a Shaw Innovation Fellow and as a consultant with the Maine Affordable Housing Coalition. And there are at least two fascinating reports on the MAHC website that I'd encourage you to take a look at. As she'll explain, the causes and consequences of the affordable housing crisis are enormously complicated and intertangled. And it seems likely that everyone will feel the effects of this crisis in one or more ways. I've come to think of this as one of the most important and least understood sustainability challenges of our time. So I've been looking forward to getting Sarah's take on this, which isn't just about the problem, but what we do about it. Let's welcome Sarah to the Mitchell Center.
Well, thank you to the Mitchell Center and for everyone in the room and those on Zoom to talk about how housing is a sustainability challenge, and especially the quest for affordable housing. I'm going to use a broad definition of sustainability today. It's really meeting our own needs without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. It involves a balance between human, social, economic, and environmental well-being. So as any good generalist would, we're going to start with a broad view, high-level view of what's the magnitude and implications of Maine's housing crisis. I am a generalist. Most people don't admit to that. It's sort of, you want to be a deep expert, not a generalist. I'm a generalist. So if there are those out there with deep industry expertise and knowledge, and you want to ask questions or make a comment, there will be time at the end. And also, I encourage that. My email is sjsturt@gmail, for those who listen later on. So we'll start with sort of what are the implications and how bad is it? We'll go down into the weeds a little bit on what are some of the root causes. Hopefully we don't get vertigo going from 60,000 to the roots, but we will try to do that succinctly. And then there are some reasons for hope. We have the executive director of MAC here with us this morning or this afternoon, and MAC and others are doing a lot in this regard. And so what I'd like to do, I have done work for the Maine Affordable Housing Coalition, but the comments and views here are my own, and they don't necessarily reflect MAC or MAC's membership. But this is MAC, and together with MERIDA, which is the Maine Real Estate and Development Association, the State Chamber of Commerce, the Portland Chamber of Commerce, and individual companies like Lighthouse Credit Union, work together to put together this video that explains why, if like me, you're comfortably housed, why should we care about this? This is a 3-minute video.
The biggest issue, regardless of where you are in the state, is to bring housing production up.
It's all geographies. It's all income strata.
Without housing, there is no community.
Maine has never faced a shortage of housing like we have today. Now is the time that we need to act.
This is a crisis. We need to take measures where housing projects aren't put at the back of the line. They should be put at the front of the line.
We need to reimagine how we think about housing.
You need to solve a crisis by bringing people together.
I was moving on the next chapter of my life.
I myself have lost probably a dozen employees, and it's because they can't afford to live here.
2 full years later, and all my stuff is still in storage.
Good morning to you.
It's a dilemma for me finding staff. We don't have a lot of options for folks.
90% of restaurants are teetering on failure.
Well, I can speak for my own personal challenges. There's no inventory. You know, there's a net deficit of 80,000 houses in Maine.
I'm looking at inevitably having to leave my community, and I don't want to do that.
Harrison has quite a bit of large parcels of land.
What could we do with this? How could that benefit Harrison as a whole?
There are ways we can do this without disrupting the fabric of the community.
We have Mainers living in our shelters who have full-time jobs and they can't find housing.
Building new homes is what's going to keep the people that we rely on able to be there in our communities.
Nurses and cops, first responders are teaching in your schools. You need to find options for them.
Without this very basic necessity of housing, everything from attracting and retaining our workforce, be able to take care of our patients, making sure our patients are healthy. If we can't achieve that, then we're not doing our goals.
The economy is built not only on tourism, it's also built on manufacturing, and we need to make attainable housing available.
How are we going to attract families and the kids into schools?
People can't find a home, they can't move into your town, they can't move into your state. For us to grow, we need housing.
Augusta needs to hear from the people of Maine that this is a really big priority and that it's impacting all of us.
People really working together with communities in the lead, thinking about what they want for the future of their community is really a critical part of the solution.
The only way this changes is if businesses, nonprofits, people, and communities get involved.
We need people to show up for housing projects like people show up for economic development.
If there's a project in your community and you're supportive of housing, that'd be a good meeting for people to attend.
When you advocate for housing, you're actually advocating for community, public safety, public health.
Our ability to create housing at all levels creates growth in our economy.
We all start saying yes to housing production. That is the only way that we're going to tackle this housing crisis.
It is critical if we want to maintain an economy, a community, and environment here in Maine that's sustainable in the long run.
This cannot be solved by one individual. It has to be a team.
So I often get asked, why do I work on this topic? And I work on it for many of the reasons that were talked about in the video. When I'm 95 and I fall and I break a hip, there are probably 100 people who need to be employed to be able to get somebody to answer the phone when I dial it, to send the EMTs and the EMT vehicle. There's going to be a mechanic maintaining the vehicle. There's going to be EMTs. There's somebody cleaning the emergency room and maintaining the x-ray equipment and running the equipment, as well as technology people, making sure that the files are maintained. It's a broad spectrum of people. And as we heard on the video, if we don't build housing, we won't have those workers. So the baby boomers right now are between age 61 and 79. So at the younger end, the retirements haven't completely worked through. Still people to retire. And who's going to take those jobs? The people that we want to hire were never born. We need to bring people in from outside the state in order to fund and staff these critically important positions. So sometimes I hear, from the community, no change, no building means no change. I don't want anything to change. And that's not right. In our quest for affordable housing, one of the key villains is time. As time marches on, more of your colleagues retire, more people can't be hired if they don't have a place to live. And the older end of the baby boomers is going to start to need additional care and support. So that's why people who are comfortably housed should care about this topic. But what about the implications for those who are un- and underhoused? It's even more dire. So I want to apply a concept that is called scarcity. There was a seminal book written by two professors in 2013, and they looked at 4 kinds of scarcity: food, financial, time, and social, loneliness. And across all 4 types of scarcity, they found the same human reactions. So I'm applying that scarcity concept to housing. And here's what the 2 professors said. When scarcity captures our attention, it changes how we think. This is across all 4 types of scarcity that they. Mental bandwidth, fluid intelligence, executive control. Scarcity reduces all of these components of mental bandwidth, and it makes us less insightful, less forward-thinking, less control. So the scarcity bandwidth tax, that ability to do computations and to have fluid intelligence, they could actually measure that. And when the thing that is scarce, the scarce resource, was triggered for that individual, when they were reminded of it, the same individual's IQ dropped by 13 to 14 points. So 100 is average, and we're seeing this decline. So let me give you a story that helps illustrate what that means. In between a multi-decade career in investment management and moving to Maine, I had a small business, very small, 5-6 people. We made a healthy snack. And we had one worker, I'll call him Dana, not his real name, but he had a very important job. It was a filling in the healthy snack food. We had 5 different filling flavors. Each day he had to make a different filling. And importantly, he had to talk to sales and make sure he made enough each week for the production the next week. So, Dana was a great guy. He was late 40s, early 50s. He had served in the armed forces. He's a really steady, strong worker. However, only after the fact did we realize that on the days when his housing insecurity was triggered, he could not count. So next week, when we're running a big production day and his coworkers are running around saying, Dana, where's the rest of the salmon fillings? We realized he made those on a day when it looked like he was physically there, but he was having trouble. It stinks for him. His coworkers weren't too happy, and it was a problem as an employer. The analogy I have is if you've ever walked on the crust of the snow and you're walking along and all of a sudden the crust breaks and you go through, that's sort of what the experience was for all of us. He was well-trained and was solid, could do his job yesterday, the day before that, boom, problem. Solid problem. So it was this erratic thing. And he was in a bad situation. He was living with somebody who he probably shouldn't have been living with, and it was a real problem for him. So the impact of the housing scarcity trap is huge for everyone. It's one of the reasons that it is a sustainability challenge. It has a direct impact on Maine's social and economic resources. And we have really not found the balance between human, social, economic, and environmental. But how do we get here? So Maine's housing challenges really have 3 components. They overlap, but you could think of them as 3 separate challenges, if you would. The first is that housing costs and incomes don't align. You've seen a lot of these charts. HRNA was the consultant that the state hired to look at that, and they were very thorough. The second piece of it is there's really, and this was talked about in the video, there's really no housing stock available at any price. And then the third piece is that you would think that if there's a shortage and a scarcity of housing, that the way to get out of that is to build new housing, except the new housing costs more than the unaffordable existing stock in many places. So this is a graph that tries to put together a little bit of data of just what is affordable. So typically 30% of income to housing is considered affordable. And obviously Maine's a big state. Different people in different places have different incomes, but I've shown you 3 different households. So I'm going to call them John, Betty, and Bob. And what you're seeing in the blue graph is their annual income. The orange is that annual income converted to a monthly housing budget. And then the gray bar is that monthly housing budget turned into a construction budget. So if we want to build affordable housing without big subsidies, what's our challenge? How big is the challenge? So let's look at John. John is a one-person household. He's a full-time minimum wage worker, which I estimated at 40 hours a week and 50 weeks a year. Both might be aggressive, but on that basis, he makes just under $30,000 a year. And at $30,000 a year, he has an affordable housing budget of $732 a month. You're not gonna get much for $732 a month. It's roughly $24 a night. You couldn't rent a RV site with water and power for that. So it's a really small number. And not surprisingly, it would only build a very small construction budget of $75,000. Betty's a little better off. Betty's in Bangor. She makes $60,000. She's a household of 2. That works out to AMI, which is area median income of 80%. So she's considered middle class. And she can afford more than John. She can afford $1,500 a month, but that only builds a $180,000 unit. And $180,000 is not really enough to build much of anything. We're going to look at some anecdotes of what you can build for different things. And then I can hear some of you saying, oh, but things are better in the southern part of the state. And yep, Bob is in Portland and he's also a 2-person household at 80% AMI, and he makes $18,000 a year more than that. So he makes $78,000 a year. And that allows him to afford just under $2,000. But that $1,900 and change monthly payment only supports construction budget of $260,000. And then I added in at the very farthest right column, the state median. My estimate is $290,000 is about what would be affordable for the median. I don't like using medians for the whole state because it's a big state and it really varies, and household size makes a big difference. But let's look at those incomes and housing budgets. So John was at 75 and the median's at 290, and Betty was at 180. So sorry, these are our affordable budgets here. Well, there are some places where you could build, have a mobile home, a manufactured home on a lot for between $250 and $275. So that might be like the Lewiston, Auburn area. There are also, Maine Housing has a rural rental program where they build very small, typically 1-bedroom apartments. And those have also come in that $250,000 to $300,000. You're probably not going to fit the median household that's bigger into a 500 square foot 1-bedroom apartment. So there's a little bit of size disconnect there. We don't have any way to systematically know what the housing costs are, so I'm just giving you some anecdotes. More typically, $300,000 to $400,000. You might see a large affordable with a capital A, meaning that there's 30% of income subsidy. Those would typically come in at a construction budget of between $300,000 and $400,000, or a very simple, maybe attached ADU. A detached ADU is going to be upwards of $400,000, and I'll show you that in a minute. AHOP is the Affordable Home Ownership Program, and that tops out at $470,000. That's a Maine state housing program that provides a forgivable loan for the construction of single-family homes. And they recognize that they cap it at a construction budget of $470. So this is somewhere in this $350 to $470 is where I think most construction would land, whether it's a multifamily or single family. And then I added this National Association of Home Builders number, because this is typically what we think of as luxury, right? 2,600 square foot house is a big house and it's $665. So let's delve into, so why is it $4 to $450 to $470? So I want you to focus on this blue line here. This is data from this LD 1453 offsite working group that DECD is currently running. And so this data is from them, and this is not all Maine stick-built houses. This is just one house in Waterboro, which is New York. But what this one developer was willing to share is that it was a 960 square foot house with a total cost of $417,000. And that works out to $435 a square foot. So how do you get that high a price? Well, these are the four pieces. So the vertical construction, or as I think of it as the volumetric construction, the siding, the insulation, the studs, the drywall, all of that, the countertops, the doors, the windows, that only came in at $168,000. So only 40% of that $417,000 was the actual unit itself. The other 60%, or roughly $250,000, was on these three categories: site development, construction, and foundation. Was almost $90,000. It's actually more than the land itself at $75,000. And then the soft costs were almost equal at $85,000. The other thing that's notable, so this is that National Association of Home Builders luxury house at $665,000, and then there are two what they call cross mods. These are manufactured or mobile homes with porches or garages or some site additions. And what you see is that this $88,000 is not all that much more for a house that's 2.5 times its size. And even for the manufactured houses, it's still sort of $80,000 to $90,000. So this is sort of the forgotten piece of how expensive things are. Land at $75,000, it varies. It's a little bit less expensive than nationally. And some people might say, oh, well, I know where you can get cheap land. And that might be true. But if there's no road to it, then this number is going to go up even higher. And the same thing with this number. So if this went to 50, you might see not really any savings as these two numbers go up. So it's a complicated, wickedly complex is the phrase that's often used, set of challenges. So if we step back and say, what is it that this world of housing construction is actually, what does it entail? And I have a picture of a Gordian knot here because it's really a very complex ecosystem. Many specialties coming together for a moment in time. That moment in time might be 2 years, but it's a moment in time, brief period, to build a custom building. Building one at a time, like a bespoke suit, tailor-made. Each new multifamily development often has a single company form, an LLC form, just for that one address. So even before there's a single site plan or design done, you've got legal and accounting expenses setting up the LLC. There are 24 subcontractors on average for a single family home, according to the National Association of Home Builders. It's a national number. I don't have any reason to think it's not true in Maine. It's more than that for multifamily. And so each of those subcontractors has to be scheduled. And when somebody retires, your network kind of fell apart. There's proliferation of requirements. So it might have been a few hundred pages of building codes and requirements in the 70s. It's now thousands, if not tens of thousands. So what we're seeing, the graph on the right-hand side is from McKinsey. And it's okay that you can't really see the scale. It's a very long time period. It's from the 50s to 2020. And what it's showing, the blue line is the productivity growth of all industries ex construction. And the red line is the construction industry. And you can see that there was some improvements through the 60s, and that little peak up right here was, in the 70s and even kind of through the 90s. But since 1995, it's pretty much been straight down. And oh, by the way, Maine's productivity is 14% less than the national number. So how do we think about getting out of this? How do we get this complicated ecosystem of specialties to think about doing things a little differently? Well, I like this image because these are hardworking professionals and they're deep in their trench, literally and figuratively. And they're worried about doing it right. They're worried about their sense of risk is this pile of dirt going to fall on my head? And is this guy really paying attention so that somebody doesn't walk through here without a hard hat? And are we going to hit a pipe that didn't get flagged, right? They're thinking about the risks of doing it right. They're not thinking about the risks of what their role is in adding to costs that means that we failed to build. So specialization is expensive and it leads to narrow definitions of risk. Another example of that would be snow load tables and engineering. An engineer is going to worry about a big part of the state of Maine doesn't have any snow load tables, so just full disclosure. So let's say a builder is building something in the part of the state that doesn't have a published snow load table, and the engineer has to come up with it. Well, they don't want to be the engineer that built something that fell down. So they're going to be very conservative in their assessment of risk for this one building. And that doesn't include the risk that it becomes too unaffordable to build. It doesn't actually get because of the cost. So this increased complexity leading to specialization, leading to bad assessments of risk, it's just really costly. We have scheduling delays, which is essentially a coordination tax. We have extra overhead. Each of those 24 subcontractors has a phone and a website and a accountant and a lawyer and tax filings and HR. And they have the full overhead. And so we're duplicating that. There are very limited slices of risk and little cross training. So what can be done about it? It's not one or two things. So my favorite question is, I'm really passionate about housing too. What can I do? I love that question. My least favorite question is, just tell me what the one or two top things are. There are dozens. So these are some of these are not unique. I put this disclosure on here because, there are very few original ideas. I don't claim to have them. But there are dozens of ways to save 5 to 10K. So thinking about bringing down the housing cost by $100,000, which is about what we need to do. Middle income would need a $100,000 subsidy to get a newly built house, given current rules and methods. That sounds enormous, but if you break it into 20 ways, it doesn't sound that bad. Really, those 24 subcontractors, they couldn't each come up with some efficiencies. So here's my sense of what we could do. What we build. Let's start with that. We could build smaller. Now, it is true that a 700 square foot house is not 1/3 the cost of a 2,100. As we saw, you have that 250,000 that's kind of sticky. But smaller is definitely less expensive. We need to build in more density. Our towns used to be very dense when we didn't have cars and people all worked at one location. They were dense. And LD 2003 and 1829 have really dealt with that. Its density is adding an ADU would be an example of adding density. you've got one single family house on a lot, and now you've got two housing units on a lot. So you double the density. So density and scale, or building in multiples, are not identical. They're not the same thing, and we need both. And I really think it's this building in multiples, not one at a time, that is often the most challenging for a community, because they're envisioning that there are going to be 5 cars in front of them at the stop sign. So instead of envisioning that you're going to have 5 cars in front of you at the stop sign, which you might, you should envision that those people are the EMTs and the emergency room people and the snow plow guy and the mechanics. We need both. We need density and scale. Foundation innovation, there's a lot going on there. I think it's important to realize that, yes, we might have become accustomed to a full walkout daylight basement, but those take a lot of cement and they're really expensive. And there are alternatives that are very good. And then storage that isn't heated. This is kind of one of mine. So HUD has quality standards. The quality standards are very specific. One of the things in the HUD standards is that you need 100 square feet of closet space. Well, at $435 a square foot, you just added $43,000 to the cost of your unit by requiring 100 square feet of heated space. Our energy codes are intense. We wanted them that way, but do we really need to have heated storage for our Christmas decorations? Dicey, I know, it's this time of year, you might, but maybe not. We could phase it. Nice to have like porches and decks and garages later. We could build for a wider range of household compositions. So multi-gen families, but also 2 non-romantic partners with 2 master suites. We could make smaller lifts and elevators acceptable and single stairway and rural lanes. So 8, 9, and 10 are being talked about in a regulatory session that's being run by the governor's office, GOPIF. And I encourage people to reach out on those topics. They are linked in my mind because they have a lot to do with fire, what our fire departments want in terms of size of elevators, staircases, and the size of the roads that as our fire engines tend to keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And so as a 70,000-pound, very long fire truck needs a very solid road to drive on next to a house, a building. And so in Europe, they have fire trucks that are half the size of the American fire trucks. And so you could use, different alternatives for parking and access. So that's about what we build. What about how we build it? Standardization is really key, getting away from this bespoke tailored suit. And there are efforts underway for that. So Bangor has pre-approved building plans. There's, I believe it will come up again. It was talked about in the spring, LD 546, about statewide pre-approval. We could prioritize offsite construction. This is its own working group, LD 1453 through DECD. The report will be out in December. But increased training, dealing with licensing challenges, improving training of both code enforcement and subs, eventually some incentives. LD 1375 is that regulatory working group that I mentioned that's taking on some of the challenges related to some of the pushback. Expedited approvals, that in part goes with standardization, but it could also be part of an appeals board at the state, and then greater use of performance-based codes. When I think of performance-based codes, I think of energy. And so here's my observation. If someone's willing to live in a 700 square foot house with 6 windows, which you can't get a lot more than 6 or 7 windows in a 700 square foot house, they already are energy efficient. And our codes are really written for the guy who's building the 2,600 square foot house with 40 windows. And so there's very prescriptive codes that say you got to have so many inches of this insulation to get to R60 in this part of the house are really designed for the 2,600 square foot guy. So I think the people who are willing to live in smaller homes, we should make it easier. I don't know if that's a BTU or kilowatt load for a bedroom, but there ought to be some performance-based way to acknowledge it. Last 5, vertical integration. Don't have that right now, but incentives to licensing and other ways to improve that would be good. There are 2 kinds of housing bonds being talked about, an infrastructure housing bond and a straight housing bond. And both of those could have number 20, which is increasing the human capacity. Some of the bonds have had money for training, for example. And then financing innovation is, again, one of my pet peeves. So we know that the new construction was coming in at $435 a square foot. The comps, the comparables in a place like Rumford might only come in the low 200s. And so that house, that new house won't get built because it's not going to get financed because the underwriters are going to lean on the state appraisal board. State appraisal board says this is how you do the appraisal. And it turns into you've got a disconnect here of the existing housing stock selling at $225 a square foot and you're at $435. Looks like a small house, new house is too expensive. So that's an example of financing innovation that we need. We need to tackle this notion. I've had developers come right out and say, I won't build smaller than a 3-1 or 1,100 square feet because of this won't appraise issue. So there's a lot being done. It's really bad. The implications are probably even worse than most people have recognized when you think about scarcity and the implications in my little story about Dana. The cost versus, affordability versus cost of new construction is out of control. But there are ways that we can tackle this, and there are initiatives underway. So the video came from Build Housing, Build Homes, Build Communities. The URL is yes-housing.me. I encourage people to sign up for it. You can go and name it and sign up. There are these 2 working groups, LD 1375, which is regulatory, and 1453, which is the housing innovation and offsite construction. When there is a housing bond, hopefully there will be, whether it's housing or housing infrastructure, please support it. And hopefully part of those bonds will be increasing human capacity. We can't subsidize all of the construction that we want without increasing the capacity, because all we will do is further ratchet up costs. So we have to simultaneously address both parts of supply and then please get involved, talk to your neighbors, and the video is a great start. Yes to housing.net. With that, I'd be happy to take any questions.
This isn't really in your purview, but I'd be interested to hear your thoughts regardless on sort of efforts to convert some of the existing housing stock that's currently used for short-term rentals or vacation homes that remain empty the majority of the year, sort of disincentivizing that use of existing home stock. And on the flip side of that, incentivizing like retrofitting of existing buildings that aren't suitable for habitation. It's versus the focus being purely on building new, land change, land use change.
So if I can just, sorry, you're interested in alternative ways versus building a new structure.
Yeah.
One would be to utilize the short-term rental properties. Is that
Or disincentivizing so many home buyers in Maine from utilizing their houses as short-term rentals, vacation rentals.
and then the second part of that was adaptive reuse. So two slightly different topics. So the only thing I have to add about the short-term rental is that the HRNA report that came out in 2023 did look at that topic. And what they found was, even though it is irritating and looms large, as a percentage of the housing stock, it actually is quite small. So the HRNA report did 3 different geographies, and I think memory serves, it was like 0.6% of the housing stock in one of the regions to like 1.5% of the housing stock in another. So one of the things that they found was that a lot of the second homes, and whether they're used for short-term rentals, are only seasonal. So they would not be appropriate for year-round occupancy. The second thing is that they were luxury. And so even if they were added to a long-term rental instead of short-term, the cost would be astronomical, would not really add to the affordability. But I encourage you to look at that HRNA report. And if you come up afterwards, I can show you the section that talks about that. And then on adaptive reuse, that is clearly the gold standard of like taking existing buildings and turning them into housing. What I've heard from Maine State Housing is, in fact, rural rental, you could do 3 things under that rural rental program. You could build from the ground up, you could renovate something, or you could have adaptive reuse. And adaptive reuse is actually more expensive than building.
That's fine.
I guess one of the interesting competing good issues is trying to build new housing that's also very energy efficient, using a lot of new tech, relatively, well, some new techniques, et cetera. But that also adds to cost. How do you sort of parse that? And are there ways to?
Yeah, I don't have great insight. So there were a new set of energy codes that went into effect in April. And different people have different estimates. And so I have not come up, I'm not even going to share what those estimates are because they weren't consistent enough for me to have confidence in any of the numbers. But it did add to cost. And it's very prescriptive. So I would say it's not the existence of the codes, it's the kind of code. So my example of most of the energy lost is through windows and doors. So by just pushing on you got to have more and more, piles of insulation or different kinds of insulation, it's a single lever you're pushing on. And really, if somebody's willing to live with only 6 windows instead of 40, then they already are more efficient. The other thing is that modular built in the factory units, so manufactured or mobile homes, single wide, double wide, modular is built to more or less the residential codes and then shipped into place. But the modular homes have no problem getting to the lower tests that they need because they can ergonomically reach places to close up air gaps that somebody who's building on site would never be able to reach. So those houses are incredibly efficient. It's one of the reasons that a lot of what gets built for modular is actually net zero. It is a conundrum, and I think honestly we should think a little bit about trading off size and number of windows for your.
Thank you. I'm wondering if there are any other states that are particularly inspiring or looking as a guiding framework.
Yeah, good question. Vermont has done some really interesting work, and they just put out a big report. All this year, they've been working on the issue. They've got pre-approved plans that they're working through. and a number of other things. They have sort of a guidebook if you want to be a first-time developer. How do you progress? You know, you might want to start with a flip and then do an ADU and then do a 3 or 4 unit building. And so it's really helpful. It's also really insightful for those of us who don't want to be a developer, but want to understand how complicated it is. It's really instructive for that. So one of the things that they call out in that Vermont work is exactly what I was talking about with the appraisal process. They call it a cash market. It's where the cost of new construction is so far above the comps because you've got apples and oranges. You got stuff built 150 years ago that when it's a windy day, you know, you can barely keep the wood stove lit. You know, you've got really apples and oranges, and our appraisal process doesn't really deal with that well. So Vermont calls it a cash market, and they basically say, you, Mr. Developer, have to build your own comps. And so this is a decades-long process, right? To find buyers, build higher comps. So that's the one part that I think we're all struggling with, just the disconnect.
Well, thank you for your presentation. So I noticed on one of your slide, you have some keywords like denser and also like vehicle parking and also like traffic stress. Yeah. So I'm wondering whether those kind of concepts like transit oriented development ever been mentioned here in Maine, and how you perceive as a kind of like a challenge or maybe opportunity for kind of like coupling with affordable housing development in Maine.
So how does transportation?
Yes.
Yeah. So I'm gonna go back to sharing because the reason appendix up was I did put images in. That's the scarcity book, just if anybody's looking for it. Yeah, so this is back to this earlier question about Vermont. This is a page out of the Vermont, and these are the 8 under new construction, which is this new construction. These are the 8 things you must have. Pink is you really have to have these soft cost services. Interesting. But I think this gets to what your question is. So this is very typical of what, you know, you have one lot with one house. And I've lived a good part of my life in a community that looks like that. And this is an alternative. This is more density. And the reason that the cost goes down, it is true that you're dividing the land cost, you know, across more units, but it's also because running the utilities to that many units, you're spreading that $80,000 to $90,000 utility runs across more units. So that's, I think, one of the ways to think about that. The infill is sort of the gold standard of what urban planners hope for. There are towns that are very eager to see that. They have inexpensive land, they have low or no zoning, they would make the infill lots available in some cases for very low cost, and they still don't have housing. So like many of these things, it is part of the solution set, but it's not, and it's maybe not even sure. So this is again from the Vermont paper. These are examples of 3 and 4 unit buildings. Doesn't have to look ugly. It can look like it fits into the neighborhood. And that there were rural rental project done in Madison that's gotten a lot of airtime and play, and people moved in last spring, I think, and that looks, you know, very much in keeping with the neighborhood. Any other questions from Will?
Yeah, so we got a couple people in the chat or asked questions about adaptive reuse. So one person asks, how do we grapple with the fact that adaptive reuse is so expensive? What policy steps can we try to take to bridge that gap? especially understanding that in some places the limit on space is so tight and there's hard limits to new construction. And then another person asked for any sort of unusual examples of adaptive reuse you've come across.
Okay, thank you. So it's where I started, honestly, in this kind of talking about, I have my first semester at Southern Maine. I had this professor, Yusung Kim, and in the class, somebody said, "Why can't I find a decent one-bedroom apartment?" Yeah, why can't you? And I started out thinking about, well, we have all of these closed stores like Sears and Augusta for those. It's since found other uses, but at the time it was vacant. Why can't we just build housing in Sears? And so I spent some time digging around, and what I found was that it doesn't have enough ventilation. It doesn't meet any of the codes. You need ventilation and access and fire. And so you couldn't actually use the interior space of those big buildings. So it was very limited. The same is true with some of the office buildings. You think about, only a few offices have windows. And the HUD standards are that every bedroom has a window. So they don't actually, even though there are 4 walls and a roof and a foundation and water and lighting, they don't always lead to being able to retrofit it to housing. Housing is kind of unique. So I don't have any great solutions or answers or policy changes, but just recognizing that every building is successful adaptive reuse, even though we would like it.
I've got one, unless somebody else wants to go. So that, not in my backyard, everybody heard of that, NIMBY? So that's a common problem for a lot of things in our world, but I wondered also with the accessory dwelling units, ADUs, what have we learned about when communities have seemed open to that, which obviously helps with the increased density that you were talking about, but I gather that not everybody's on board. Are there things about the process, the community engagement, the facilitation, negotiation, conflict resolution that you see being effective, and maybe we should scale those up?
So I have not heard of community backlash against ADUs in that way. And so let me start with, I don't really like the term NIMBY because they're concerned community members. Now, not all concerns are equal, but they're engaged in their community, and generally that's a good thing. And as we heard from Professor Jacob, the rural voters are unique in how much they care about their communities. So community engagement is not necessarily a bad thing. I have not heard, doesn't mean it doesn't exist, but I have not heard of a lot of pushback against ADUs, mostly because it's just one unit. Right? Most of the pushback that I hear is more around congestion and scale more than the ADU density. The challenges with ADUs from my perspective are more around the math. So the way they work best, as I've understood it, and again, there are others out there, Backyard ADU is built over 100 of these. But the way it works best is if the existing landowner, whoever that is, whether that's mom and dad or it's adult kids, the existing landowner has equity in their house because they're not going to be able to borrow enough to build a $417,000 house in their backyard. So the banks are moving to include the value of the new unit in the debt to value and the income, if there is income coming, in the debt to income. But you're going to have to borrow more or less as if you were doing a $400,000 renovation. And so you have to have equity the way it works best is if you already have equity in the property. There's also who owns it. So mom and dad are putting in the 400,000, but they don't have the deed. So who's borrowing the 400,000 or the 300,000 or 200,000? So the financing is still a challenge because it's so expensive to build. I think if it were less expensive to build, then it would be a little tight. But that's the challenge I know of with ADUs. And ultimately, you're asking a homeowner to become a first-time developer and a first-time landlord. And so again, the way it works best is it's already a family relationship. The math does not work to build a $300,000 or $400,000 ADU and charge $1,500 a month. You would lose money every month.
Last call.
Well, thank you all.
Yeah, let's thank Sarah again.